And now we're going to continue on the subject of hybrid warfare, what that means, with a special look at Poland and the wider region. For that, we're joined by Aleksandra Wiśniewska, Polish Member of Parliament, Civic Coalition.
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome. All right, so let's begin with the first question. If we look at hybrid warfare, we hear that in the news, we're covering it, it's a sinister word, but how do you define it, and how do you define what Russia has done so far when you're talking to ordinary people?
Correct. So hybrid warfare is really anything that escapes our traditional notions of the conventional warfare. So what Russia has been doing, since it obviously so far has no interest of launching a conventional war against NATO, right? It has been using subversive tactics to avoid attribution and to avoid retribution. So by using attacks such as sabotage, espionage, disinformation, cyber attacks. Our Ministry of Digital Affairs has, for instance, stated that Poland is currently in the top 3 countries worldwide when it comes to the number of cyber attacks. So in fact, we keep pushing back against them all the time. So even though we don't see perhaps a D-Day, or a shock and awe operation, the war against NATO from Russia in cyberspace, in the internet, cognitive war, against the safety and security of our societies, the cognitive warfare is happening and is already here on the daily basis.
And we definitely talk about hybrid warfare more often than before. But how do we counter these attacks? I mean, is NATO, is the European Union, are we doing enough to counter this?
So just today, as it has been just announced recently, right, our Prime Minister Donald Tusk has announced that additional 100 million złotych, Polish złotych, will be allocated for our internal security agency and for our intelligence and counterintelligence, right?
So how are these money used?
So yes, to better understand, right? Especially when it comes to potential threats of meddling in the upcoming elections. So ladies and gentlemen, these upcoming European elections will be such an opportunity for the Russian propaganda and for the Russian disinformation to be spread, to undermine our values, democratic values, to try to support as much as possible the narrative of especially the extreme candidates, particularly the extreme right candidates, such as such as Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, Salvini, Viktor Orban, so the populists, the extreme populists that undermine, that stir the pot, that try to show that the.
But let me interrupt you. But do you think? I mean, because there's a thin line between just freedom of speech and somebody else's opinions and then propaganda and then stirring trouble. What do you say to that? Can we just assume that if somebody doesn't agree with us, they are spreading propaganda?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we have facts, we have the truth, right? So we have all across ahead of the political campaigns, right? We have tags online, fact-checking essentially information, right? So it is very much in Russia's interest to support the candidates that undermine our continued support to Ukraine. And today, is the 811th day of the war in Ukraine since the Russian reinvasion on the 24th of February 2022. And I've just returned from Kiev 2 weeks ago, where I visited with the other members of the parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, so the Ukrainian parliament, the Vice Prime Minister Vereshchuk, Vice Prime Minister Kubrakov, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And when we clearly see that the war is really going to another phase. So that phase of really scorched earth tactics from Russia. So using the time that has been lost while waiting for additional military aid from the US, using the time that has been lost while trying to pass the supplemental in the Congress, avoiding the political stalemate, to essentially try to gain additional territory and break through the lines of the Ukrainian forces. We see it in Kharkiv, we see it in Donetsk.
But that is indeed a worrying point. But I think I want to bring us back to the European Parliament elections and also what's happening in Poland. One thing you said as well, I think we're increasingly living in digital societies. There is this whole bad treasure trove of disinformation that Russia has been pushing. And it's not just a matter of they've been doing this for a few months, they've been doing it for years. We saw what happened with Voice of Europe within the European Parliament itself. So you mentioned earlier that Prime Minister Tusk is making available more money now. But we have less than 22 days before these European Parliament elections. All these things take time. So how can we make sure that citizens, not just here in Poland, but in the region, in Europe, how do they understand what's at stake here?
So, I've been using every single day that I can, you know, and every ounce of my energy, including earlier today, I've been on a panel in the Warsaw School of Economics with the ambassador, Vasyl Zwarycz, ambassador of Ukraine, you know, trying to essentially say that there is no time to ask ourselves, you know, if this is our war or not, you know, or to what extent should we be involved, or to what extent we should rather look at the issues of the farmers, of the transportation, you know, because all these tactical issues, you know, are undermining our strategic unity, you know, and strategic unity on the level of NATO against Russia. And essentially what is currently at stake is that in these coming weeks and in these coming months, so it's not a matter of years, you know, we have the existential threat over Ukraine, and we have to ask ourselves very difficult questions such as, you know, what if the aid is not delivered in time, and what if Russians manage to push through, and instead of having Ukraine struggling for its life behind our eastern border, we suddenly have victorious Russia? What that would imply in terms of political repercussions? How would it embolden China and Taiwan, you know? What it would mean economically as well for the Polish taxpayer, for the American taxpayer, to instead of supporting the brave Ukrainian army, fighting maybe with our arms, but with its own blood, to instead of that be arming ourselves at our very border, you know? So we have to really wake up, you know, because the time to act is now. It might not be the case in 2, 3, or 4 years' time. And the European elections and creation of the European institutions in a way that we have strong democratic representation, you know, we had a huge heartwarming and touching victory of democracy in Poland, you know, with such enormous voter turnout. And now we have to rally for every single one of us to go and vote again, because so much is at stake.
So much is at stake indeed, but I think, as you pointed out, this existential threat, which is also something, I believe it was former Mr. Sikorski said this, that the countries further away from Russia tend to spend less in terms of defense. That existential threat seems very different for certain countries. Even in our own neighborhood, if we go to Slovakia, a very different type of mindset when we look at, I mean, a place also which has been a fertile ground for disinformation by the Kremlin. So again, I'm looking also at how we make that switch and how we make it, of course, it's that battle with Ukraine. It's the battle that we must keep Ukraine free. But for some people in Europe, it seems far away. And you mentioned the farmers as well. They see it very, very differently. So when you see it, how does that make you feel as a politician representing your government, your party? Where are you most concerned when you look at some of these hybrid threats? Because we have migration issue, we have disinformation, we have cybersecurity attacks.
Because when we talk about hybrid warfare, we usually talk about energy sector. But is it just an energy sector? I mean, obviously it's not. So what are other vulnerable?
Yes, so energy sector is extremely vulnerable, of course, the transportation sector as well. But I think that you know, when it comes to politicians, we as policymakers are caught in a very difficult situation, you know, because suddenly we have to balance out the international, very fragile architecture of international security, you know, versus state interest when it comes to particular issues that have been neglected over the past 8 years and have been badly neglected since also the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you know. When it comes to modernization of Polish army, you know, our previous purchases have been made ad hoc, with lack of transparency, you know, with lack of rationale and lack of logics behind this, such as the issues of, you know, of liberalization of the transportation in the border. You know, all these issues have to be raised on the European level, and our Prime Minister Donald Tusk has been doing this already to communicate to our European partners also the interests of our farmers, you know, the interests of our transportation sector in Poland, you know, because only as Europe are we able to actually have policy solutions that are adequate to respond, you know. But I have to say that we have to educate ourselves. We have to ensure that the next generation, you know, that unfortunately is raised already in the shadow of war, you know, understands, you know, that we not only have moral obligation, you know, but this is really a matter of our own security, that the best strategic investment that Poland and the rest of the EU can currently make, whether it's Slovakia, whether it's Hungary, you know, so badly mired by populists currently, you know, out of the elections as well, that our best strategic investment in Polish peace and security is victorious Ukraine. And by victorious Ukraine, we don't mean Ukraine that is supported for however long it takes. We mean victory with Russia on the territory of Ukraine to push away the war from our borders as far as possible.
But you also mentioned education, and who should educate civilians? Is it government's job to do it? Or maybe it's not, because we talk about hybrid warfare, we talk about cyber attacks, but regular people are not aware of this. They get up, they go to work, they turn on their computers, sign in.
They use social media,
They do not sign out. Speaking of cybersecurity, so who should educate our citizens here in Poland and in the region?
So I truly believe that in times like this, everyone, every citizen has a role to play. And since the war of Russia is a total war, you know, using all possible dirty tactics against civilians as well. So breaching the international humanitarian law, breaching the Genevan Convention, targeting the civilian infrastructure, not only in Ukraine, but abroad, targeting the media, the international community, you know, polls here. And not always by only saying, you know, what we're saying is not true, what the West thinks is not true, but undermining it, oh, but is it true, you know, to try to steer this doubt, to implant doubt, you know, in what is currently happening ahead of the European elections in Poland. So I believe that everybody has a role to play, and we also have to work on civil defense, you know. So currently in the parliament, I'm a member of the parliamentary team working on civic defense, you know, together with the Ministry of Interior. You know, I've been listening to the ministry on how can we best ensure that our civic society over the coming years, you know, builds not only the societal awareness, you know, of the threats, but also understands, you know, how can we support each other medically, you know, how can we be safe at homes, how do we understand when attacks come, you know, how do we become robust against disinformation. And this is a preparation that will really never stop, and each one of us has a role to play. But I truly believe in the strengths and the character of the Polish society that we had so beautifully shown in the beginning of the war. And it really didn't come at the time from the government, it came from the Polish people, you know, opening its homes and hearts to the Ukrainian civilians. So I believe that we as a Polish society have a great capacity not only to do it at home, but also to be a role model, you know, as a responsible leader of the NATO's eastern flank. And we have such geopolitical role to play, almost a historical one, due to the tragedy of this war. But
I think you're putting an interesting point there, because I think we've seen that as well in those countries that are the most supportive of Ukraine, supportive of and aware of these dangers. If we look at the Baltic states as well, the Nordic states, many of them either already have or are reintroducing conscription for one. Something that the population is also part of. Civil defense things are engaged more. They're building bunkers. There's more of a, let's say, a resilience culture. Is that something that we see also now in Poland? Do you see that as something also taking root here? What's your opinion on that?
Absolutely, I do see citizens becoming increasingly more aware. You know, I see my friends, signing up for self-defense classes. You know, people trying to seek perhaps purchasing new, if they consider purchasing, a new real estate rather far from something that might be considered, critical civilian or military infrastructure. Far from the government or administration. These are all wise decisions to be made. But primarily we also cannot allow the fear, to be stronger than our resistance, than our resilience and our resistance, and we must be defiant and remain calm and remain collected, and also remember, that if the anti-Ukrainian sentiments are rising, those that benefit from it are really Kremlin regime, and what we have recently seen with Tomasz Schmidt, the former judge, deflecting and escaping to Belarus, is also an example of the fact that our country, over the past 8 years, our rule of law, our democratic institutions have been attacked by people that have been directly linked to Belarusian authoritarian regime. And one of the gaps when you look at the sanctions globally, is Belarus really, not only because of the hybrid war that is launching against Poland on its Polish-Belarusian border, cynically using the suffering of people on the road, and absolutely leading to horrifying crimes, but seeing how what actually Lukashenko is afraid and what Putin is afraid is not that much an expansion of NATO, is the expansion of democracy. Like every single dictator, what Kremlin is most afraid of. Exactly.
But right now, as you speak about the war, would you say that Polish counterintelligence at this vulnerable time for us failed by not exposing Tomasz Schmidt earlier?
Well, I believe, that Tomasz Schmidt clearly associated with the, with the previous ruling party as well, and with their attempt to attack our independent judiciary, to politicizing that judiciary as well, that has led to enormous losses, such as obviously an enormous loss of EU funding as well that we've managed to regain back right now after.
But to be fair, I mean, he was promoted by Aleksandra Wiśniewska, then he was promoted by Lech Wałęsa, and then also by Bronisław Komorowski, as he said this before. So he was around for many, many years. It's just the question, how come they waited so long, or well, they didn't expose him at all? He had to flee.
I mean, ladies and gentlemen, currently we're facing a situation, right, where we're really trying to rebuild a state that has been nearly lost. It is perhaps a strong statement from my side, but I believe that the Polish democracy would not have have managed to survive another 4 years of the rule of the previous government of law and justice. And I decided to run in the elections. I was a humanitarian aid worker in Ukraine for the past year and before in the Middle East, before running the elections. And I decided to return from Ukraine and running these elections to try to civically engage myself against the authoritarian rule, because I believe that in times of war, we cannot allow, our country to be in hands of populists. That's why these European elections upcoming right now are so critical as well.
There's one. Sorry to interrupt, because you mentioned your own time in the Middle East, and I think if we can sort of switch gears to a quick moment here, because we've just had, I think, a comment here that we want to just show you here. This is Mr. Sikorsky commenting on the Israeli ambassador Livne. If we can roll that now, because we do want to get your opinion on that. So let's show that to you and our viewers now.
The Israeli ambassador is allowed to share the views and interests of his country. Whether the Polish public opinion is swayed to his side or not depends on the way he presents those views. What's good for Poland and what isn't will be determined by the Polish government, not foreign ambassadors. This matter is very important. The vote that we held alongside 142 other countries wasn't against the State of Israel, it was for the two-state solution. This is in accordance with the Polish policy of recognizing the Palestinian statehood, which we've been upholding for the last 3 decades. So, for us, this vote was just confirmation of our stance. We weren't the ones who called for this vote. However, since the Council went ahead with this vote, we had to decide on how to approach it. You'll agree that it's not easy for Deputy Speaker Bosak and MP Żukowska to agree on things regarding Poland. And in this case, they were in agreement. In my opinion, the Israeli ambassador needs to get to know us better and realize that Poles don't like being talked to in a condescending tone.
So there we have Foreign Minister Sikorsky on this historic vote in the United Nations. What do you make of his comment there, and also what that means in terms of Polish and Israeli relations?
I think the comment was very accurate, to be frank. I think that Ambassador Livne has not been the most shining example of Israeli diplomacy, And in fact, he's been undermining the Polish relationships with Israel. And it is extremely clear, that the interests of Israeli state security are very dear to Poland, that Israel until now has been always our ally, And as one of the very few democracies in the Middle East, we hold Israel to a high standard also when it comes to respect of international humanitarian law, when it comes to respect of Geneva Conventions, all which have been violently breached and attacked in this current horrific war that is currently being launched against Gaza. And I have myself spoken in the Parliament a couple of times on the fact that as unfortunate as the 7th of October Hamas attack and barbarian and terroristic has it been, what we have seen so far, we have seen complete bloodshed. We've seen over 33,000 Palestinians losing their lives. We have seen over 75,000 Palestinians being injured, over 70,000, an enormous amount of Palestinian children becoming unaccompanied and losing their parents, We've seen humanitarian aid workers, including Polish humanitarian aid workers, being targeted and killed. And this has to be condemned.
Right.
And we live in times where we can actually see it with our eyes.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's an important point.
Recognize a two-state solution.
Yeah. And I think that's one issue which is going to, I think, really captivate a lot of this attention, not just here in Poland, but I think also internationally. And thank you for all those insights. So we went from Russian hybrid war around the world, but thank you so much for your insights. That was Aleksandra Wiśniewska, a Polish member of parliament. Really appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you
so
me.
much.